Hi, good evening. Welcome back. This is English 122, Pikes Peak Community College. I'm Chris Moreno. We're working on thesis development on logic and argument. This is the online 12-week course of English composition, the second portion of the course. The overall arguments that we've been making in the discussion posts have been sensational. I love your posts. I love your responses. You're kind to each other. You're articulate. You're thoughtful. You're getting into some very intense, important debates and questions in your responses. I want you to continue that. It's a safe community. You're kind to each other, and that's important. But more than that, you're really working with each other. I love that. I want you to keep that up. I've read through some of the 1A submissions for the description, analysis, and evaluation assignment. They're fantastic. Your writing is controlled, it's clear, it's strong. I like that. I want you to keep doing that. Those are the focuses I want to keep in mind for this course. I want to touch base with a couple of things, and then I'll go into the lecture section on thesis development and logic and argument. I want you to remember the 3 C's about writing: clarity, concision, and coherence. I want you to remember those 3 things. You'll see those over and over again in my responses to you. When I give you assessments, those are the things I'm looking for. So one of the things I've posted is a PowerPoint called Thinkabouts, and every week I put 2 different big topic-y things on there to think about, just words to think about in terms of writing, to improve your writing. I try to make them to go hand in hand with the topics of the week. So we've looked at clarity and audience, some of the things that I want you to think about this week: control and counter arguments. Counter-arguments will come in handy when you're writing your thesis, and also for the logic and argument section. And then control. Control is an important element in your writing. I want you to really think about what I mean by keeping control. Control demonstrates authority, but control also makes you the master of your argument, in that you don't let other sources that you invite into your text as evidence, you don't let them speak for you. So you need to interpret your evidence. You need to tell your audience exactly what they need to see in your guest, quote unquote, coming into your paper, what they need to see with that evidence, how it's speaking. You want to control your transitions so that they're clear, that they effectively link topic to topic to topic as you're developing your thesis. You want to make sure that you keep in mind your audience. You want to show your audience you know who they are. You want them to know that you have something in mind for them, a so what, something's at stake for them. So those are the elements of control. So really think about those ideas when you're writing. Another thing I wanted to talk about before we go into the lecture thing is I want you to think about when you're revising a paper. At the end of your writing, you want so desperately that cursor is done blinking and you want to save the thing and submit it. You want to never see that paper again. That's pretty natural in writing. But before you do that, take the time to revise. And if you don't have a lot of time to revise, look at some things. One, I want you to look back at your so what. Do you give your audience something that they should do, something to think about, to change, to act in a different way, the thing that is at stake in your thesis? The other thing I want you to look at is your thesis. Is your thesis, after you read through your paper again, does your thesis really set out what your paper does? And if it doesn't, restate your thesis. And that's the last component part when you're going through a revision, is really check that your thesis states what your paper does. One tip for a revision that I like to use is to read my paper out loud in the strangest accent ever. So one way is to use a deep Southern accent. I'm not from the South, so if I read my paper out loud and I sound like I'm from the South, I can hear everything that is a flaw in the reading. Because when I'm reading it out loud, I think I know what's coming. But if I have to affect an accent, I end up reading exactly what's on the paper, and I can hear those flaws in my argument. I can hear the flaws in my grammar. That's one tip. You don't have to use a Southern accent, but some people use an English accent. Some people use something very odd or, put on a caricature. Read it out loud to somebody in your family, friends. Ask somebody to be a good listener for you so that they can give you the feedback. Sometimes they don't know what you're talking about, and that's okay. But as long as they can kind of follow along, that's what you're looking for. So going into then what we're looking for this week in the lecture, we're looking at thesis development. And the first point of constructing an argument is your thesis. Keep in mind what you want to do. What is your goal in that paper? So we talk about purpose and subject. We're putting those together, synthesizing who is our audience. You want to have a context. So you're thinking about something that is a big enough argument to make that you have to have context for it. You want to think like a reader as you're constructing your argument. What does your reader need? What do you need your reader to do? So thinking of your so what in mind, what's at stake for that reader? So your thesis generally is a master claim. It's responding to a problem in some way. It can be filling a gap. If you remember the old From Inquiry to Academic Writing text that we used this even up to last semester at Pikes Peak, they talked about filling the gap in information, responding to a problem, provoking a new inquiry, or answering a question that may need answering. Correcting a misinterpretation, that's another one you might want to think about. You want to pose a problem and analyze it and then propose a solution. So these are ways to think about what a thesis is in general, how to set that up. A thesis generally, you'll hear this over and over again. It's arguable, it is defensible, supportable, it requires evidence to support it, to develop it out. It's a problem that you need to contextualize for your reader. You need to locate your argument, the background of why it is important, the who, what, where, whens. Those are the things you need to set out in your context so that you can locate to your reader exactly why you're constructing this thesis, what your master claim is doing. The master claim binds the whole paper together so that it leads to your natural structure, point by point by point. We call them thesis points. Your topic sentences, your claims that delineate each paragraph all go back to supporting that main thesis and work as a thesis point. You want to think about in a thesis, you want it to be provocative. By what we mean by that is not horribly like lewd, anything like that. But what I'm looking for provocative is it's thought provoking. It makes people want to speak about something. Provocative, to call forth, to talk about, to call, to really discuss. You want it to be complicated enough that it shifts over the course of your argument. You don't want it to be simple and evident. You want it to be complex so that your reader has to really think about it and want them to engage in it. You want it to be focused enough, so you want it to be complex. You want it to be complicated, but you want it to be focused enough that it's manageable in the space of the plan of your argument. You don't want to talk about in the history of time because you don't have the history of time. You don't have all of time to create that argument about the history of time. You want it to be significant. You want to reflect an awareness that you understand that problem. So if you're going to be talking about an argument, making a political argument, so right now, ripe for the picking in American politics, whether you're pro-Democrat, pro-Republican, pro-in-between, any of the above, none of the above, if you don't demonstrate to your reader right off the bat that you understand the context, the situation at hand in the political argument you're about to make, then you shouldn't be making it because you haven't established that authority right off the bat. You haven't contextualized that you have an awareness of the elements. When I start talking about writing a thesis out, you have to set out the issue that's under question. And question is the right word to think about. Questing, questions. That's how you develop these theses. This is how you write an argument. And you want to think about where you're going with the paper. So you start with this is the situation, and this is where I'm going. So here, the situation, here is the so what. You want to keep in mind the so what for your audience. And somehow your thesis could anticipate that, so what? You don't want to come out of left field and say, I'm arguing that dogs are superior breed to or superior species to sand if you don't know what the so what is. If you all of a sudden then come out of the blue and say, well, planets are better than both, where did that come from? You want to make sure that you locate and contain. So a working thesis raises questions. You want to revise keeping in mind that your thesis is adjustable. And if you have to go back, look at your thesis again, you want to adjust it. A thesis should predict the so what. It encompasses all of the information that you have used to gather that information. It may not all go into your paper, but you want to at least acknowledge somehow or show, demonstrate to your author, to your reader, that you understand this topic so much that everything that is in this argument is part of your understanding and not out of left field. So I'm going to go through just a few things about a thesis that I have seen in different textbooks. So one is, remember the little Siegel handbook, if you have that from English 121, and they just talk simply, key elements of an argument. It's a clear and arguable position. Arguable, meaning that you need claims and evidence to work it through. You need to give the necessary background information. You need to contextualize where that argument comes from. You have to give good reasons, and that's where we're talking about logic, and that logic will come in when we talk about logic a little bit later in this lecture. You want to give convincing evidence. You want that evidence to be something that is controlled. Again, that control that we talked about in the think abouts. You want to be able to control and use that convincingly, not just randomly scattering out pebbles into your paper. You want to make sure that that evidence is convincing. You want it to appeal to your reader's values. So you have to have in mind who your reader is, who your audience is. You want to keep a trustworthy tone. That goes back to control, it goes back to authority, clarity, all those elements in there. You want to make sure that you sound trustworthy, knowledgeable, that you're not a lunatic just ranting and raving, because then they won't read your paper. You want to consider counter arguments. Counter arguments is another one of those think abouts this week. So counter arguments, you don't have to account for all of them, but you should know them. So you can incorporate them. One strategy is you can say point, 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 and then the counter argument. However, I state this. So you can use it as a way to position it. You can turn your thesis completely around in response to the counter argument. Say, well, now we have a nuanced understanding we can modify in this way. So consider those counter arguments, know them. You can incorporate those into your argument or not, but know what the counter arguments are. There's another textbook that I really like. It's called Writing in Response by Matthew Parfit, and he has this very small portion where he talks about a thesis. And he says, quote, and this is from page 116, and this is going to be from the second edition of this textbook. I want to get in the habit of citing my sources. So he says, quote, a thesis statement is much more than a topic or a general subject. It suggests what the essay seeks to accomplish rather than merely what it talks about. And he goes on to say it requires a supporting argument. He says it relates to a recognized problem, a question, or an issue, and it has a motive. There has to be a motive behind writing this thesis out. Like you want to solve this problem. Thus, a thesis has energy and a direction that will keep the essay moving forward. And I want you to think about that energy. So I'm going to come back to Parfit a few more times in our course, but what I wanted you to think about with a thesis, the way I understand them in my head, and of course you can see by my house, my crazy dogs, I've got mice leaping around, I wish they'd go back outside. I'm kind of a scattered lunatic, as you can probably see, but what I want you to think about, I see a thesis as an octopus. An octopus is a strange, complex looking creature. It has a lot of tentacles. And when you put an octopus at the beginning, it's all tight. And when you lay it out, it's interesting looking. You know it's got something there, but it's something that needs inquiry. You need to find it out. And when it spreads its tentacles out and pushes down to push itself forward, that's what your thesis will do through your paper. So your tentacles, your thesis points, are all part of that big component beast, that animal that pushes itself through with momentum. And as it picks up speed, it grows in its beauty and momentum and power. So I know that's a really strange analogy, but that's one way I think about, do all of my tentacles fit my thesis? Does it have momentum as it builds? Is it pushing down? So thinking about pushing on that idea harder to push that argument further. So that's just one way I think about a thesis. A lot of other people will say it in different ways, but that's my analogy. Another thing I want you to think about with a thesis is that it offers an assertion based on the awareness of the topic. So you offer something that may not be evident to your reader. You're giving them something that is not apparent to them that really needs that supporting argument. There are three models you can look at, and this comes from the inquiry from academic inquiry to academic writing that we used to use. We talk about correcting a misinterpretation, and you can start a paragraph with that misinterpretation. Although X says Y, I say Z. And then you could do a gap filling. However, which is another mode of writing, you can modify others' conversation. That's where we talk about a synthesis paper where you're joining a conversation already in place that may not have accounted for one more voice or have not considered another element. So those are the ways I wanted to think about a thesis. Another thing I wanted to think about with a thesis is that a thesis is not entirely uncontroversial. You don't want it to be boring, you want it to be simple. It's not a summary, it's not vague or broad. It has to be specifically focused. If it's too personal, then you don't have too many places to go with it. You don't have a lot of evidence to give. If it's argumentative, you need to give that supporting evidence. We'll talk about evidence, which is what logic is. If it's controversial, if it's debatable, it's not obvious. Again, you have to dig in and give evidence. It's supportable. You need to find that claims and evidence. And if you're starting to see the pattern of claims, evidence, they're like a conjoined twin that goes with your thesis. So if you go backwards as you're thinking about your thesis, your evidence leads to your claim, which supports your thesis. And as you're writing your paper out, you start with your thesis, you add your claims and evidence. But as you're thinking about and planning your paper, find your evidence for your argument, find a claim, write a claim about that evidence, control that evidence, and then relate it back to your thesis. You want to think about a directed thesis. You don't want it to be too out of this realm. You don't want to start on one end of the spectrum and then jump to another and jump to another. You want to stay focused, directed, cohesiveness. That's what we're talking about, coherence and cohesiveness. Another way to think about a thesis, and then we'll move right on to logic, and I apologize, this is going to be a little longer than we like. I want you to think about the significance of a thesis is something that is worth arguing about, whether it's worth arguing about to you if you're saving the world, something that big, or it can be something very small that is particular to you. I think we should ban the use of, bottle caps because they're clogging up the sewers. If it's important enough to you to find evidence to argue it out, then make that solid. It's significant to you. So I want you to think about, as we move from the thesis, and I put up some PowerPoints to help you with the thesis. There's a PowerPoint called Principles of Argument that I put up under the note-taking lectures and PowerPoints. So that's available to look through. You can just read through some of these things. You're not going to be tested on them, but they're just ways to think about an idea better because we don't really have a substantive textbook. I'm sorry that our OER is just little tiny snippets of things. So I really want to make sure that we can really gather the information that you need. So I'm putting a lot of stuff in a lot of places in a different format, lots of media to get that information to you. So I apologize, it's very disparate, but there's a lot of information. If you're not getting it one way, if the OAR isn't giving you the information, then feel free to look through some of the materials I have up. But that principles of argument really buckles down on what a thesis is and should do. You can also reference Purdue's OWL website. I can't talk enough about that. It's such a thoughtful, well-written online writing lab. It's the Purdue OWL. You can't find a stronger writing website. And that's my argument. That's my thesis. So I wanted to go on to the next section. We're going to talk about logic. Logic relates to argument in that logic is the principle that holds the argument together. So the principles involved in constructing your argument, logic holds that argument together. Rhetoric is another adjunct of it. So we were looking at rhetoric this last week, reading through for analysis. Rhetoric is how you put external features in your argument to make it appeal to your reader. So you add those appeals to emotion, to logic, to ethics. You make devices, put metaphors in there, repetitions, rhymes, whatever you need to do to decorate that. But logic is the thing that's binding your argument together. Logical flaws or fallacies are rampant. So you'll see this especially in political arguments. We can't find a more ripe community to say, I'm going to hunt for some flaws in logic. Just turn on the debates and you got them right there. Or read any of the tweets that are coming out, and I don't mean any disrespect to the president or to any members of Congress, nothing like that, but I want you to see that the rhetoric they're using full of flaws, logical flaws. We'll look at those. So going into what logic is, we're looking at the reasons that bind an argument together, the rational reasons. So we're looking for things that are valid claims, evidence, giving validity to your argument. So one thing that I posted up was a link that comes from Pikes Peak Community College, and it's for this text called An Illustrated Book of Bad Arguments, and it is fantastic. It's by Ali Al-Mosawi, and I hope I didn't pronounce that too badly. It is funny, it is articulate, it's seemingly simple, but it is not. So for example, this is just a random page, and that link is up there to get to. This is called An Appeal to Fear, and you have the political cartoon that goes along with it. So some of the logical fallacies you'll see are things like, I'm going to create a straw man argument. So I'm going to divert attention and attack this fake thing that I've set up because the real thing I'm not attempting. Or ad hominem, you've heard that a few times, where you're attacking the person rather than the argument. So if I say, and I'll just use an example, when President Trump says it's fake news, he's creating an ad hominem kind of argument when he says, oh, well, I can't trust, Chris Cuomo on CNN, fake news, fake news. He's arguing that whatever is coming out is all fake news, so he can't really look at the news. Or he's saying that I can't trust Hillary Clinton when he was running against Hillary Clinton because, look, she's got all this bad email stuff. But he's attacking her rather than the situation that was the problem is national security being compromised. So those are just some things to look at. I have a PowerPoint up. I have a PowerPoint up for everything. I really like these PowerPoint things. It's called Logical Arguments, and it breaks down the arguments, the fallacies, and tells you the principles of logic. But one of the things I want you to think about with logic, and then we're almost finished for the day. You want to think about, as you're creating an argument, you want to state the premises of your argument. You want to establish the context, what's going on, what is the premise behind what you are arguing. You want to think about evidence, credible evidence that will support not just your master thesis, your master claim, but all the individual claims, those thesis points, the tentacles I talked about, those claims that need evidence every time you put out a claim. You want to put some evidence to support that. You want to use that as credible evidence. And we'll talk about that a lot when we go into the research modes for the modules 2, 3, and 4. But you want to make sure that you're not finding fake news. You want to find a real, credible source. So not just a source that seems to know what they're talking about. I would not ask my dog what he thinks of chicken because, he loves chicken. But I might ask a farmer or a rancher, somebody who is in animal husbandry in some way or agriculture. What do you think of chicken? And I want more detailed, and I would get a more credible piece of evidence to support an argument I might be making. You want to then, and this is where logic comes into play and is the final chink as you're bringing all these things together in an argument, is you want to demonstrate the conclusion you draw to come up with your thesis and towards the so what, that conclusion follows logically from the premises you put out. So you don't want to just say, well, I think that we should all eat chicken because my dog loves chicken. Is that a logical argument? Not necessarily. I think we should all eat chicken because chicken is going to save the planet. How do I know that? Because I asked X, Y, and Z. They're credible sources. They are into agriculture. They're experts in their field, and so they know, and I've cited them, so I have credibility so that my argument flows logically from the premises to the conclusion. So the last little bit I want to talk about is going back to the Partfit book on writing in response. And he talks about two ways to think about logic, about reasoned argument. So there are two types of reasoning when you're putting forth a logical argument. One is called deductive reasoning and one is called inductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is used often where you say you go from a part to a whole or from particulars to a generalization. So in my case, I have out of control terriers. You've heard them leaping around, yipping in the background. I apologize for that. I can say dogs are awful pets to have because they bark uncontrollably. I'm making an inductive argument because my terriers, my particular terriers, I'm making a generalization about all dogs. So these two problem terriers are bearing the weight of all the dogs in the entire universe. And it's a flawed argument in that sense, but that's how an inductive argument would work. Not all inductive arguments are flawed. So you want to think about that. And when you're looking at science, scientists look for those particulars so they can make a generalization. And that's where you have the tension, for example, in climate change argument. They're looking at the particulars in different areas of the world, and then they're making the overarching inductive argument that this change here is happening, this change here is happening, this change here is happening, therefore climate change is happening. You can see the counter argument to those arguments because they're saying that induction is not necessarily logical or doesn't flow completely. If you can keep doubling down with your evidence, then you have a strong argument. Deduction is probably the easiest way to understand an argument and logic. And deduction is when you derive a conclusion from other statements known as premises, and a proof can be formed. So you know this from geometry. I had geometry so long ago, I don't even think it was called geometry. But geometry is when you're trying to find a proof from a series of premises. If this, then this. So you look at a number of prior statements, and one way to look at deductive reasoning is a syllogism. So if you say, for example, all humans are mortal, and then that's a major premise. and then a minor premise, all Greeks are humans, and then the conclusion, therefore all Greeks are mortal. You've done a syllogism, and that's part of deduction. If you want to look at Sherlock Holmes, for example, boy, he's the master of deductive reasoning. So those are some examples. Another portion of deductive reasoning that we don't really go into in detail in the PowerPoints that I've done, but it's called enthymeme, and I always say that wrong. Enthymeme is a formal logical process. It's called an informal syllogism where you're missing one of the premises. You remove them. So you go from a major premise to the conclusion without adding a qualifying. So, for example, if they say caffeinated drinks affect sleep, therefore Coca-Cola will affect sleep. you it's seemingly correct, but you can look at the flaws and say, but it's not in every case. So you want to look at those kind of controlling these things. So the reason I'm telling you about deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, giving you PowerPoints is that so you can guard against those kind of things when you're creating your argument. In your basic argument paper, just be aware of these kind of things, but when you're doing your researched argument, you better have these kind of things under control so that you don't give your reader any opportunities to doubt your authority, your control. You want to be clear, concise, coherent. You also want to be the master of your paper. You want to control everything. You want to be authority because you're an author, and that's what we want to do. So please let me know if you have any questions. I'm happy to help in any way. I apologize for being so crazy, so scattered. It really is my sincere happiness, pleasure to help you, my intention to help you in any way I can to master English 122 and get through college writing. So have a wonderful week. Let me know if you have any questions, and I apologize again for being so scattered.